Good evening, everyone, and thank you for participating in tonight's virtual town hall hosted by Senator Jesse Solomon and Representative Lauren Davis. My name is James Gold. I'm moderating. Some of you have submitted questions in advance, and we're going to relay those questions to Senator Solomon and Representative Davis. You may also submit your questions live in the comments section of the platform you're watching on, whether that's YouTube or Facebook Live. Please submit your questions now as soon as you can, and we'll try to answer as many as we can tonight. Before we get started with questions, the lawmakers will give some brief opening remarks, so I'll hand it over to you, Senator Solomon, to get us started.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We are in the middle of a short session, so we want to make sure and get a few things done, but we're not redoing an entire budget. This is a supplemental year. So I'll just review some of the top issues with you and leave enough time for comments and questions because I think that's mainly what people are here for. I think the most important issues that we're addressing this year are housing, education, climate, and behavioral health. These are statewide issues that affect just about every Washingtonian. And so we need to make some substantial lasting progress. We are clearly in a housing affordability crisis. We want to make sure and prevent the worst effects of rising costs without limiting supply. Yeah, that's my view. And so we're going to talk, I know there's questions about rent stabilization. We can talk about that. I have a bill moving that I worked on with Representative Mia Gregerson around co-living. Not a solution for everybody, but what it does is would require the allowance of shared kitchen facility with smaller bedrooms that are independently lockable, and it would open up a new housing market for retirees who want to live in a community together. The bill supported by AARP, and also for young people, for example, that might want to live on Capitol Hill or near sort of exciting, vibrant communities, but wouldn't otherwise be able to afford it. This could really unlock that opportunity. I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change and the climate change initiative that's before us, a big existential threat to our communities and our societies. We're seeing wildfire, water issues, so we're going to need to work on that. I'm going to talk about our investments in education. We've had over $200 million allocated in the Senate budget for paraeducator pay and raising the cap on the amount that we can pay for special ed, so more funding for special education. And then also funding for behavioral health. And I have my seatmate, my esteemed colleague, Representative Davis, who knows all about behavioral health. And so I want to give her some time too. And let's hear from her. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much to those of you who are making the time to be here or watching this later. We really appreciate your engagement very much. So as my dear colleague said, it's a 60-day short session, lightning fast. We've only got a couple weeks left. I will mention a couple, I would say in so many ways, this is the session of kind of three things: behavioral health, housing, and public safety. And just to mention a bit, so behavioral health is where I spend a lot of my time. The House and Senate both unveiled their budgets earlier this week. The House budget contained a number of items related to addressing the fentanyl crisis, everything from kind of upstream prevention and education in schools, naloxone access in schools, outreach modalities like the Recovery Navigator program that help close the gap between individuals who are interested in care for substance use disorder and individuals actually receiving care, and kind of providing that guidepost and navigation in a very complex treatment system. The Recovery Navigator program also serves as a point of law enforcement assisted diversion for individuals who become entangled with our criminal legal system because of their untreated behavioral health challenge. I also was excited to see a proviso that I had that included in the House budget related to rapid induction on methadone or Suboxone, also known as buprenorphine. Essentially, the idea of bringing patients who are acutely ill with severe opioid use disorder into the hospital for short stays and stabilizing them quite quickly on medications, and then being able to discharge them without any withdrawal symptoms. I'm continuing to work a lot in the public safety space. I serve on the House Community Safety Committee, and seeing lots of bills trying to address in a thoughtful way and an evidence-based way some of the increase in crime that we're experiencing. I have a piece of legislation that's now in the Senate. Senator Solomon just voted out of committee today. Thank you, Senator. Related to first responder wellness. So taking a look not just at our law enforcement, but also firefighters, emergency dispatchers, and how do we support those professionals so they can really be their best selves on our worst days. And that passed the House with unanimous support, and encouraged about that. Continuing to go through. I'm continuing to work on, along with my Senator Solomon as well, on addressing public health harms associated with high potency cannabis specifically, and tangling with the industry a bit. And I think I'll pause there, keenly interested in folks' questions and comments tonight.
Thank you, Representative. So C. Jensen would like to know, Senator, what you're planning to speak to on initiatives and what will be done about the citizen initiatives that have been submitted to the legislature.
Thanks for the question, and I'm happy to answer. I just wanted to also bolster Representative Davis' point about the high potency marijuana. It's not obvious unless you learn about it what the problem is there. The problem is, especially for young people, it's driving psychotic episodes and cannabis dependence. Those are real documented things. Maybe 20 years ago, when Reefer Madness was some old movie that was silly, it wasn't a thing. But now, because you can buy 100% potency THC products, it's actually something that we're concerned about. So that aside, in terms of the initiatives, so there are 6 initiatives to the legislature that have qualified. So we have the choice of adopting them, or allowing them to go to the ballot, or allowing them to go to the ballot with an alternative. I do not believe we're going to present alternatives. There is, we're going to hold hearings on 3 of them with the, I think, intent, can't speak for everybody, but the intent of passing those into law. That would be vehicle pursuits, the state income tax, and the parental rights. And so I'll take those from the top, those 3. The vehicle pursuit basically changes the standard from probable cause to reasonable suspicion, the standard of when you can pursue and stop a vehicle. To me, that actually makes sense. I'm going to support that change because it goes back to what we had before, where you didn't already have to have all your evidence before you stop somebody. Sometimes it makes sense to be able to stop somebody to investigate and then make an arrest decision. And I think we have situations now where you can literally back your car into an ATM or a store, take the ATM, drag it off, and because it doesn't qualify under current rules, you can't pursue as a police. So I do think we need some revisions there. In terms of state income tax, the initiative says that you cannot do a state or local income tax. That's essentially current law. And what if we adopt an initiative, it's the same as adopting a law. And while there is no clear appetite for passing a state income tax, I mean, that's just not happened. I guess my point is basically continuing what's already in place. And these can be changed in the future once we adopt them, if there's a push for that and if it makes sense. And then in terms of parental rights, the debate around that gives me some pause in terms of, I believe we need to protect the LGBT community, et cetera. But when I read the Parental Rights Initiative, it essentially references current law. It says, parents have the right to see medical information of children who are getting treated at school. They have a right to see the grades. They have the right to opt out of comprehensive sex education, which is current law. It literally references current law. So I'm comfortable with that as well. But we are working with our LGBT members of our caucus to make sure that there's enough comfort around there. We just want to really be sensitive around that. That's important. That's a value that we hold. I think capital gains, long-term care, and CCA are going to go to the ballot. It's important to note that capital gains funds our investments in early childhood education, working families tax credit, and school construction. So if we do lose those revenue sources, it's gonna be a significant hit. And I'll say that 3,300 people in Washington State pay the capital gains tax, and almost everybody benefits from the result of that. Long-term care, I think 70% of our retired folks or retiring folks will need some kind of support, so that makes sense. And then the Climate Commitment Act, another funding source, and we'll talk about our efforts at low-income energy rebates that we have in the Senate budget, but it's a funding source for a lot of our mitigation programs. A lot of communities are hit by wildfires, flooding, et cetera, and we need to find a way to mitigate with that, and those dollars help. And it also is designed to ratchet down carbon emissions over time. So that's something critical that we need to continue. Thank you.
Thank you. And then the next question is for both of you. T. McCormick asks, for safety and accessibility reasons, we need a pedestrian and bicyclist bridge across North 205th Street to connect the shoreline portion of the interurban trail with the Edmonds portion of the interurban trail. How can you help?
Thank you for that question. I want to make sure that Representative Davis has a chance to answer a lot of these questions, but we have sort of divided them up. I've been working, and Representative Davis, Representative, you've been working on a ped bridge on 145th, and that's been a lift, but we've gotten a lot of state and federal support for that. Again, that would be endangered if the CCA initiative passes, because our funding source for a lot of those transportation investments is the Climate Commitment Act. So, I mean, frankly, we need to finish that before we're in a position to look at additional ped bridges. We have a I-5 crossing at 195th as well. I understand that's not what this question is about. But I think, frankly, it'd be tough to get to the next bridge at this point without knowing what our funding situation is post-initiative.
Representative Davis, if you have nothing to add, we'll switch to our next question. So T. Marshall would like to know, housing affordability is a crisis in Washington State, and it's causing many to have to move around. Most recently, he says, to North King County. Rent stabilization is a tool that can prevent tenants from facing economic evictions while still allowing landlords to raise rent in line with inflation. Do each of you support rent stabilization policies, or how do you feel about the best way to make housing more affordable in Washington State?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. So, when we think about housing, we kind of think about it in three broad policy levers to address the housing crisis. The first is supply, so just sheer number of housing and living units. Senator Solomon mentioned his good work on the co-housing model. We've passed legislation in recent years related to ADUs, or accessory dwelling units, or DADUs, detached accessory dwelling units. Last year, we passed groundbreaking legislation related to middle housing, so essentially upzoning for multiplex type housing close to transit. And the House just passed a transit-oriented development bill that builds on that. So that's kind of the housing side of the ledger. And then there's supply, support, and then stabilization. Support, also thinking about how do we provide services for some folks who need additional services like permanent supportive housing, that sort of thing. And then finally, stabilization, and that's where the rent stabilization comes in. And we really haven't actually made many, if any, advances in the stabilization area. I'm actually one of the only renters in the state legislature. I think there are 4 of us out of 147 lawmakers. And I, too, have had the impact of landlord indicating they were going to significantly raise rent with very little notice. And it's difficult to kind of weather those economic impacts. So I was very proud to advocate both in caucus and in the broader House in support of the rent stabilization bill. That bill did pass off the floor. And just for anyone who's watching, I do think it's an important distinction between sort of rent control and rent stabilization. Rent control sort of permanently controls the price of a particular housing unit. Rent stabilization controls the price during a tenancy. So I rent, and it puts a 7% cap on an annual raise of rent for a given tenant. But as soon as that tenant leaves, the landlord has full discretion to charge market rate. We know that the average tenancy is only about 2.5 years. And so the landlord can pretty quickly turn that unit over and raise the rent, frankly, astronomically if they so chose, but it at least provides some predictability and stability for the renter during the course of their tenancy.
Thank you. And I'll just add, I think we need a policy that effectively balances the ability of renters to stay in their apartments or their homes without constraining the housing stock. I don't know what that right number is. We have an economist professor in our caucus who, in the Democratic caucus, who I think will help us through that discussion should this bill make it out of Ways and Means. What I would be worried about is disincentive. We need to build about 1 million new homes in this state in the next 20 years to meet demand. If we drive investors out of the state, if they say it's much easier to just take my money somewhere else, we wouldn't reach that goal. So it's a fine balancing act. I certainly understand the high cost of rent, but I'm trying to be responsible in making sure that we don't do more harm than good. So where that number is that's a decision we're going to have to make in caucus.
Thank you both. So the next question is about the fentanyl crisis and substance use disorder. What is your plan to fight the fentanyl crisis, and what more can be done to treat people and treat Washingtonians who suffer from substance use disorder?
Thank you to whoever asked that softball question, because that is very much in my wheelhouse. We are doing a lot. Is it going to be adequate? Is it going to be enough? Absolutely not. But we are making a lot of strategic investments. I'll start by saying that when we think about the substance use disorder continuum of care, it sort of has 4 component parts. The first is prevention, right? So trying to prevent individuals from developing substance use disorder in the first place. The next piece is outreach, and that is working with individuals who do have a substance use disorder and who are not engaged in treatment. The data is pretty shocking. Only 6% of individuals with substance use disorder ever are able to engage in treatment. And yet the vast majority, 80 to 90% of people with substance use disorder want treatment. And so outreach efforts try to help close that gap between the willing and then trying to figure out how do we actually access our incredibly complex, difficult to navigate system. And then there's treatment, right? That can be inpatient residential treatment like people think of typically. And then that could also be for opioid use disorder, specifically fentanyl use disorder. The most effective treatment by far is medication treatment. So the most common and most efficacious medications to treat fentanyl use disorder are methadone as well as buprenorphine, also known as Suboxone. And then finally, recovery support services. And so how do you keep that disease in remission long-term? That's things like recovery housing, employment and education pathways, peer support. So the legislature has made and is continuing to make with the budgets just released investments in all 4 of those categories. A couple that I mentioned specifically. So we have a huge issue with access to methadone. So methadone is the most effective medication to treat fentanyl use disorder. And 2/3 of Washington counties have no methadone clinic. And so that is a huge issue. And so we have invested in vans, more mobile methadone vans, to try to increase access, particularly in rural areas. I am working closely with Senator Dingra on legislation. We had bills that kind of had shared content, and her bill is now before the House Healthcare Committee, trying to make it easier for individuals to get into and stay in residential or inpatient addiction treatment. There are a lot of insurance hurdles artificially that are erected, like saying, oh, you've been in jail for a week, so you've been sober for a week, so you don't qualify for inpatient anymore. So that is now going to be prohibited under this legislation, kicking everyone out after 28 days and saying, you've been put in the fix-it machine and you're all better. That practice will end in this legislation as well. And then making sure that individuals are actually afforded access to those medications that I'm describing. And the last thing I'll mention is we invested in 2021 in a program for medications for opioid use disorder in jails. So we know that about 50% of individuals with opioid use disorder will end up in one of our 58 jails in this state every single year. And so if we're interested in addressing the fentanyl crisis, unfortunately, jail is probably a good place to start. And so we are, in the House budget, we are expanding. There are 58 jails. Currently, 19 have access to those medications, and we are expanding to an additional 19 with the investments in the House budget.
And I'll just add to that. So all that is good, and I think there's something else that I've been fascinated about working on, and it's a new drug. Well, it's not new, but it's new sort of to the United States. It's called Ibogaine. Kentucky, with their opiate settlement dollars, was looking at and held about 15 hours of hearings at using this to treat opiate use disorder. What's exciting about it is it shows that we have studies that show that after 1 year, after a single treatment, 30% of people with opiate addictions have been abstinent. And I think that's a better result than anything else that we have. In this world, it's a very exciting result. It is listed as a Schedule I drug because it's psychoactive, but it's not addictive and it's not an opiate. So I have a funding request in. We're going to know in the next couple of days whether we get it, for the University of Washington to study Ibogaine as sort of the beginning, hopefully, of clinical trials that will ultimately bring this to market. There's a lot of challenges. There's not a lot of profit in it for the pharmaceutical industry to invest in because it is a close to a one-time treatment, not a lifetime of pills. But I think it's very effective and very exciting. And it's frankly the most hopeful thing that I get to work on in Olympia. And I'm going to keep trying to push it forward.
Thank you both very much. The next question I think is on a lot of people's mind. This comes from Odessa. How will you reduce the cost of the CCA for mid and low income state residents?
Well, that's a good question. And I'm not sure that it's fair to say that the CCA is costing residents money. If you look at gas prices, are coming down a lot. It's not necessarily driven by the CCA. It's driven by a number of complex factors. But what we are doing, recognizing that costs in general are just very high. The Senate is trying to invest $150 million in rebates for low-income folks to pay for their energy bills. We also have a number of grant programs to help people with energy transition. So moving towards geothermal or electric heating, away from fossil fuels. And so it's important that we don't just add costs to people who are struggling, but that we help fund that. But that is essentially how the CCA is designed. It's going to be a lot more negative in terms of impact if we don't do anything in terms of energy transition. So change is hard, but I feel it's necessary.
Thank you. So the next question is a big one. How are you advocating for Shoreline Public Schools this session? As you may know, Shoreline's unreserved fund balance is anticipated to be 0.6, and in order to avoid a negative balance and binding conditions, they are considering reductions in staff or possibly a school closure. And yet we're seeing more investment at the state level in education. So can you tell us a little bit about your support for education?
Great question. And this, I think, is top of mind for so many families, not just in Shoreline, but we actually have 3 school districts in our legislative district: Seattle, Shoreline, and then Edmonds Public Schools. And we have heard all of the stories. I had a Shoreline Public School student, high school student, very tearful, sitting across from me in my office earlier this year about the inaccessibility of school counselors for her and for her peers related to all the mental health concerns that have increased dramatically. And, I just want to break down some of the things that we think about when we think about education funding. So we hear discrete needs like that, need for school counselors, music programs being cut in the Edmonds or threatened to be cut in the Edmonds School District, things of that nature. And education kind of breaks down into different component parts. So you heard Senator Solomon talk about the Senate passing a bill related to paraeducators. So that's a huge need, right? We are short on paraeducators. Paraeducators can assist with special education, among a variety of other important roles that they play in the school district. There's also something that has come up a lot this session called MSOC, which is materials, supplies, and operating costs. But essentially, that is the most flexible money that schools have and can use that to kind of at their discretion. There's also funding associated with collective bargaining agreements, so funding our salaries and benefits for our teachers and school employees. And then there's also, we've invested pretty significantly in something called the community eligibility provision, which is school meals. So the entire school is allowed to have free meals in partnership with the federal government and a match of federal funding if there's a certain percentage of students in a particular school who are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. So there's all these different kind of components, and unfortunately they end up competing against each other. Another component that was brought up was the prototypical school model. So we have this model that says, you should have 0.7, nurses per high school or 0.3 social workers. And that model hasn't actually been properly looked at or redone ever. And we've tried to make these little incremental adjustments. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, education is sort of bleeding in all areas. Every area that I just outlined and mentioned has needs, and the Senate funds some of them and the House funds a different some of them. And the answer is actually yes. And unfortunately, particularly because it's a supplemental year, the size of our budget is just not adequate to meet the need. And so we're forced to make these incredibly difficult choices. So we're trying to work in partnership with districts and support districts so they're not having to make these terrible choices about laying off staff or cutting programs that are popular and life-giving for our students. And at the same time, trying to manage the very limited resources we have and addressing things like the climate crisis, the fentanyl crisis as well. Ultimately, what we really need is an ability to really look at our state's revenue streams more properly and come up with a sustainable way to pay for education in an ongoing manner.
And I'll just add, I have a young child in public school and in Shoreline, and I love it. I enjoy it. I think it's a great school. He comes home and says, I was like, how's school? He's like, I love school. I'm like, okay, that's great. But we do have challenges. I mean, we had a shot of funding federally from the COVID relief, but it hurts to lose that. And I think that's part of what we're going through. We are losing enrollment. So one thing I'd like to see in our districts is, we've all tried to attract families, new families. Cost of housing is an issue, but we've tried to do that. That would help enrollment. And then we are investing in increasing paraeducator pay this year. Yeah, well, at least I'm pretty sure the House budget has it, Senate budget has it. It's a big priority for the education community, and also investing in why is that escaping me? Special education cap increases. So the state caps how much money can be spent per dollar, what ratio can be spent on special ed, and we keep raising that every year, and we're raising it incrementally this year. That's what we're working on doing.
Thank you both. This question comes in from Victor. This is for you, Senator Solomon. In reference to SB 5851, that is the Holocaust and Genocide Education Curriculum Bill, Victor wants to know why the bill focuses on one particular group and how you would address people who want both anti Semitism to be dealt with and the suffering, prejudice, and discrimination of other groups.
I understand there's another question similar. Maybe you can ask that question. We'll answer it together.
Sure, yeah. And there is one other question in addition to how you are ensuring the Jewish community of Shoreline feels safe when anti Semitism has been increasing recently.
Well, some of you will know that my grandparents were Holocaust refugees to the United States, barely escaped with their life. I grew up in the Jewish community, so that is a very personal issue for me. The Holocaust Education Bill, I think, was a good bill, and it did open it up to other genocides. But the bill is probably not moving forward. It just died a couple days ago. What the bill would have done is take a Holocaust education model curriculum that's being taught in some school districts and make it mandatory. The Holocaust was, I think, the most well documented, oddly, by the perpetrators and by victims of any genocide that we have. A lot of what's happened in the past, history is lost because it's not well documented. So if you're looking at something to teach from, that would be an effective event. So I think that's part of the reason why there was focus on that. But I agree that we should also include, and it always has included in the curriculum, other genocides. In terms of combating anti-Semitism, it is on the rise. We are investing in security grants in the Senate budget for safety around synagogues and other members of different religions for their safety, and a number of other items around that. So it is top of mind. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Senator. So this next question comes from Andrew. How are you improving public safety when it seems many problems around the state are getting worse?
That sounds like a question for Rep. Davis. Things are getting worse. What are you going to say?
I'm happy.
So I think the vehicle pursuits is one fix. Last year, we had a bill that dealt with drugs. So for a couple of years, based on a Supreme Court ruling that invalidated the drug prohibition laws, we tried to do something that said that you would get a referral to treatment if you're using drugs in public. There became sort of a groundswell of opinion that we needed to do a little bit more on the criminal side, so we made it a gross misdemeanor. That has to play out. And I think we're also seeing a shortage of treatment centers. We're seeing a shortage of police. And so all those things need to be sorted out and worked on. And then I think you'll start seeing some of those issues improve. Also, housing is driving a lot of this. Like, being homeless is hard. I think being homeless to an extent drives addiction. And so keeping on plugging away on housing. I know Representative Davis cares passionately about this. I've had bills on housing every year for the last number of years that have mostly passed. So we're doing what we can.
Yeah, I'm happy to add a little bit on that. So the first thing I'll say is the public safety issues are very real, and it's important that we take them seriously. And there really has been sort of a sea change in terms of our constituents in our district expressing feeling unsafe. And I do want folks to know that is a top priority of the legislature. When we think about public safety, I think it's important that we think about a bifurcation in crime. Not all crime's not a monolith, and so there are crimes of poverty, crimes of mental illness, crimes of opioid use disorder, and then there are crimes of power and control, crimes of serious violence, and those are often not the same thing. And the differential responses to each of those types of crimes, and ensuring that they're evidence based. So when we think about what we call sort of the quality of life crimes, again, crimes of poverty, behavioral health related, looking at multiple points of intervention and diversion from the criminal legal system into pathways of treatment and recovery, but with accountability. And that can look a variety of different ways. Sometimes it looks like in the form of civil commitment, so an outpatient court-ordered treatment, but it's through the civil side as opposed to through the criminal legal system. We passed a big measure about that. Sometimes it's programs like the Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion or Recovery Navigator program that I mentioned earlier. Sometimes it's specialty courts, therapeutic courts like mental health court or drug court, or even sentencing alternatives. I had an amendment today, or earlier this evening, on a bill related to the mental health sentencing alternative in the House Community Safety Committee. And I also worked on legislation this last year, omnibus bill related to intimate partner violence, which is unfortunately spiking. I also want to recognize that we really do need to figure out how to increase law enforcement staffing. We have had for years the lowest number of law enforcement officers per capita in the entire country, and that has real results. So, for example, to use domestic violence as an example, in 50% of the cases when law enforcement respond to a scene of domestic violence, the perpetrator has fled the scene. And we are so inadequately funded and staffed for law enforcement that we don't have the ability for law enforcement to go look for that person, or even to come back the next day, or go to that person's work to try to address that situation, possibly arrest that person, possibly enter a no contact order and protect the victim. So that's a challenge. We had a pretty harrowing presentation in the House Community Safety Committee in December of last year, right before session started. And there was some researchers who were looking at Washington state data, and they indicated that 61% of all violent crimes in Washington state in 2022 were unsolved. And they gave a couple case examples of other states that were actually able to massively increase their solve rates, but they did it with increasing detective units and targeted investments in law enforcement. So we do need to think about that. And we also need to think about how do we attract and retain excellent public servants in the profession of law enforcement, and what can the legislature do to contribute? And frankly, what can we all do to contribute to that?
Thank you, Representative. So we have one last question. Oh, apologies, Senator Solomon, if you have something to add.
No, I don't have.
Okay. So we have one last question, which I know we kind of went over a little bit, but I do think some people have additional interest. We talked a little bit about CCA and keeping costs low, but how are you working to prevent climate change and protect younger people who may not be able to vote, who might not be at this town hall, but who will be affected by climate change down the line?
So I will go back to the Climate Commitment Act that we passed. I was a co-sponsor of the Senate bill that passed, because it is a model. Only California passed a similar law. So we are taking the lead as states, and we're also looking at linking our markets for carbon reduction with California and with Quebec. And we're hoping that other states will also move forward. One can argue that the issue is so big and so worldwide that only one state and the acts that they do aren't significant. And my counter response to that is, if no state acts, nothing will happen. Somebody needs to test the model and to take the lead. And I think Washington has been quite forward-looking in this work. And we are transitioning to electricity as a lot of our source of power. That was already the plan before the Climate Commitment Act, so it dovetails together. And I think it's hard to argue that we're not seeing changes in climate that are scary. We do have serious loss of our glaciers, which is our water supply, our insurance bank for water supply. And right now, what's happening in the mountains, literally as we speak, is we're having rain events instead of snow events. So the rain is melting the snowpack. So come this summer, I think we're going to be in a drought situation, which will abet the wildfire situation, right? I mean, where I grew up here, we didn't have wildfires, we didn't have smoke, and it seems like now we have 5 seasons, right? We have spring, summer, fire season, fall, and winter, and we need to get beyond that. It's hard to live in that situation, and so I think we have to adapt and mitigate.
Thank you, Senator. So the next question is coming to us. This resident is concerned that the state is not meeting its obligation to fully fund education. The state sets a requirement for school districts to meet special education needs through the McCleary decision, but the lack of funding, they feel, has significantly impacted school districts like Edmond School District, which has a higher rate of children with special needs who might need more funding, who might need more special education services.
Yeah, thank you so much for highlighting issues related to special education specifically. This is an enormous need, and it's an enormous equity issue because our learners who we are leaving behind are, by definition, individuals with special needs and special education programs, and that is in so many ways discordant with our democratic values about equity. So this is just like the education bucket. There's a lot of sort of subcomponents when we think about special education, but the one that was mentioned. So the state has this sort of artificial cap that basically says the state will fund education services for students in your school district up to the point of 13.5%, meaning if you have a given school district such as Edmonds, who in the student population you have more than 13.5% of students on special education services, then you are not going to get that state participation. And of our 295 school districts, about 80 to 100 school districts have a special education population that is north of that 13.5%. So the House budget, and it sounds like perhaps the Senate budget as well, there's budgetary action and then also corresponding legislation to actually lift that wholly artificial cap on special education. Another just piece of policy that I'll mention that massively disproportionately impacts our special education students, although not exclusively, is there's a bill that my colleague, Representative Lisa Cowan, has been working very hard on in the House related to restraint and isolation in schools. I work in mental health for a living, and we use the term seclusion and restraint, and that term is used commonly, but in the context of inpatient psychiatric care. And I was rightly horrified when I saw the term seclusion and restraint used in the context of an education bill, and come to find out that we routinely actually use isolation and restraint against children, and that 70% of the incidents of restraint and isolation are against elementary school children. And so instead of providing adequate staffing to be able to support these children, instead of being able to provide adequate training and de-escalation training to the staff that are working with them and providing the supports the students need, we are engaging in room clears, we are restraining students, and the experience can be incredibly traumatic. I actually just had a high school student from the district who was down for an advocacy day with the school earlier this week, who spoke to me about her experience as a former special ed student and how incredibly traumatic it was, and how what we really ought to strive for is really integration and having paraeducators if needed, but having students fully participate with their classmates. So I think it's in many ways a shame and an embarrassment the way we've underfunded special ed, and I'm proud of the investments we're making this year, although I fear that they will continue to be inadequate.
Thank you both for answering so many questions tonight. It's 7:15, so that concludes the Q&A portion of our virtual town hall. thank you everyone for coming and joining us tonight. I want to pass it over to Senator Solomon and Representative Davis one last time for some closing remarks. And I would like to remind everyone, we didn't have time for everyone's questions tonight, but if you have questions for the senator or the representative, please email our offices. We'll be happy to get right back to you. So Senator Solomon, if you have any closing thoughts.
I just want to thank everybody for coming tonight. We get really busy here during legislative session, and I know I focus really intensely on the bills. We deal with about 600 bills in a session, which is intense. But it's really good to find ways to connect with our constituents and hear the questions that they're thinking about. And I think we're pretty on point in getting that right. A lot of these questions are about the things that we're working on, and I think we're pretty dialed in, but it's really good to get that feedback, and it's good to just feel like we're able to communicate outside this building. And so thank you for coming.
Yeah, I'll just echo my colleagues' thanks and gratitude. Thank you for being engaged. Thank you for your civic participation. I think the statistic is that only 2% of Americans know who their state lawmakers are. So thank you for being part of the 2%. But really, it matters tremendously. We read all of the emails that come from constituents on a wide variety of bills. It matters to me and to my colleague, I know tremendously what the people of Linwood and Malik Terrace and Edmonds and Shoreline and Northwest Seattle and Woodway are thinking about, what's important to you, what's happening in your neighborhoods. I'll also just say this is a very long interim. So interim being the time between when one session ends and the start of another. We get out of this marble castle here on March 7th and come home, and all three of your delegation actually live in Shoreline, but we're around, and would just really welcome folks to contact my office again about issues that are important to you. If issues are important to you, they're important to me, because that's my literal job, is to represent you. And so really look forward to getting to meet folks, getting to, if there are things to tour you want me to see in the district, and look forward to meeting some folks in person and continuing these conversations. I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.
I want to echo that and just add, so during the interim is a really good time to come talk to us about bill ideas. Anything big or ambitious takes a lot of work. It's not just dropping a bill and hoping it passes. It's talking to all the stakeholders, people that would have objections, thinking through all kinds of details. So starting early is much better, rather than coming in December right before we start. So I want to invite you to contact us when you have things, and ask for meetings and ideas, April, May, June, July. Start working on them. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both very much. And thank you so much, everyone who took the time to participate in tonight's virtual town hall, for your questions and concerns. That concludes the 32nd District virtual town hall this evening. At the conclusion, I'll leave the screen up for a little while with both the senator and the representative's email information. And I hope you all have a wonderful night. Thank you.